Hey all. Today I've got an amazing lady on the show, Miss Wendy K. Smith. Wendy's a co-author of the book Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems, written with co-author Marianne Lewis. This really goes into a topic that's really important to me, which is that how do we create a better future, both economically, socially, but also environmentally. And often these aspects have a lot of tension between them. To gain more information on this key topic in ways that you can look at creating outcomes for both, please go to the Enterprise Excellence Podcast website to resources. And there is a lean, agile, and green information document. There's also a system boundary maps and different templates you can use to explore the outcomes of environmental and economic positions to help your company move forward for that better future. Okay, let's get to the show.
Welcome to the Enterprise Excellence Podcast, where we aim to help create a better future. Learn from our world's experts how to improve and create enduring, high-performance, low-impact enterprises. Learn how to enhance morale, customer and purpose centricity, focus, and calmness. Learn how to create and sustain a culture of excellence at all levels of your organisation.
Welcome to episode 176 of the Enterprise Excellence Podcast. Such a pleasure to have Dr. Wendy Smith on the show with us today. Wendy is a professor at the University of Delaware and co-founder and director of Lerner Women's Leadership Initiative. Wendy has a doctorate in organisational behaviour from Harvard Business School and a Bachelor of Psychology and Political Science from Yale. Wendy recently released the book Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems, written with a co-author, Marianne Lewis. Navigating the often competing forces in our lives and work can be challenging. I look forward to discussing this topic. It's close to my heart, particularly in achieving outcomes environmentally, socially, and economically to help create a better future. Let's get into the episode. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Brad, thank you for having me.
I really appreciate it. Wendy, where did the inspiration for Both and Thinking come from?
Well, first of all, it is lovely to be here with you. I know you have a global audience. As we were saying when we got started, I just spent 6 months down under in Sydney, and so it's lovely to be here with your Australian audience as well. And this book is 25 years in the making.
Wow.
We've been studying and researching this book, both myself and my co-author, Marianne Lewis. And when I started grad school, when I started my PhD, to your point about green, sustainability, mission-driven, I ate a lot of Ben & Jerry's, was really intrigued by the emergence of the social responsibility movement, Ben & Jerry's, The Body Shop. I was really intrigued because in the United States, we had just seen the fall of companies like Enron and WorldCom for ethical collapses. And I believed that there was a way in which companies could be a force for good and not a force for bad. But I was working at a consulting firm, a management consulting firm, right before starting my PhD. And most of my colleagues believed that number one, capitalism had a very clear bottom line. Some of you might remember Milton Friedman's 1970 New York Times headline that said the social responsibility of corporations is to their shareholders, to their bottom line. So most people believe that, and they believed that leaders and managers couldn't hold both of these competing demands simultaneously. So when I went to grad school, I was intrigued about what would it look like, why, and how could leaders hold these competing demands. That then spiraled into a really expansive conversation about holding competing demands more broadly.
It's amazing. And I guess you've seen a massive evolution through your career on that, like from that era where it's just about the bottom line. And I got to admit, I started in that era where everything, I remember sitting in boardrooms and just hearing that conversation too. And you're thinking, yeah, does it have to be? And so you were triggered early on to look into that space and go, right, how do we navigate this?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And
And it wasn't easy. At that time, when I was working with my advisor, who I really am so grateful for, a brilliant advisor, and he said to me, Wendy, if you study this, you're probably not going to get a job in academia. Like, this is not really interesting space. And by the time, and I didn't, I ended up instead studying a similar associated related tension. I was studying IBM's top management teams and how they manage the ongoing tension between the operational excellence of what we need to do today and the innovation change, shift to tomorrow, and how they dealt with that tension. But then as soon as I graduated, he came back to me and he said, Wendy, this social financial stuff that you're interested in, do it now because it's incredibly important. So Brad, to your point, we have seen that world change significantly multiple times over the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, and I guess it's ratcheting up, and like I guess I know from listening to the book that there's a lot going on from your side in America and about the world too. But we got to keep ratcheting up, don't we? It's like your book has come at a very pertinent time. But I'd love to hear that from your side. Is like, why is it important today to improve our ability to embrace both these competing tensions that they've been seen as, haven't they? They've always been seen as completely competing.
When we wrote the book, so one of the things that we argue is that we found is that we face multiple tensions. So whether it is this tension between the missions and the bottom line, the markets, people, and people, planet versus profits, whether it's the tension between today and tomorrow, innovation and existing product, whether it's tensions between managing for the global or the local, whether it's tensions between managing more cooperatively or competitively, like they surface all over the place. And so truly, I went from studying or wanting to study this social responsibility tension to wanting to explore this idea of how we navigate tensions. And they're intertwined. They are reinforcing. And when I first started studying, we stumbled upon and are advocates of, and I'm going to take us to the theory lens or to the abstract for a minute, the idea that underlying these tensions, we tend to experience them as an either or, that we feel the competition between them. They are in competition. So we want to pull them apart and we want to make a choice between them. What we argue is that kind of thinking, that either or thinking, which is so natural, is limited at best and it's detrimental at worst. And in the book, we unpack why, and I'm happy to unpack why. But the important piece here is that what we argue in the theory part is that underlying these dilemmas that we face, these tensions that we all experience, we argue are these paradoxical demands. And we use the word paradox to link to a really long, really extensive tradition of realizing that competing demands are not only competing, they're also reinforcing, interdependent, and synergistic. And if we're going to get to a better place, we have to notice that and then retrain our thinking to value that and find other ways to navigate these tensions.
Yeah. Wendy, I love the analogy that I heard either from one of your speeches or the book. I can't properly remember where I heard it, but it was the yin and yang symbol where we've got two paradoxes on either side of the yin and yang. And we got to walking that tension line, throughout that religion, it's been spoken about that is a place of enlightenment. That is a place of great things. But I understand, and I really reflected myself that either or thinking is easier in a way because it's like, I'll do that or I'll do that. Let's just do that, right? That's easy. Let's just go do it and let's forget about that because my brain, I don't want to try stress over both. Do you mind unpacking that a little bit, and the power of walking that tension line, like that middle line between the paradoxes and getting a both and outcome?
Yeah. It's not easy to make decisions, but it is definitely, our brains do go, it is easier to say we're going to, and the way that we're trained is that we're going to face a dilemma, pull it apart and choose between it. And that is much easier. Just by way of example, I have twins. They're now 17. When they were little, there was lots of things that would come up between the two of them. Who gets to, I don't know, sit in the front seat of the car? Whose movie are we watching? Who gets to choose the dinner option? And you have to make a choice there. It just feels, but those choices are so, and that's kind of a minor example to then bringing it into the business world of who gets the resources for X, Y, and Z, or how are we spending our time as a senior leadership team, or how am I spending my time as an individual in the workplace? And so these kinds of dilemmas come up all the time, and they beg us for a choice. They beg us to make a decision. And that's, and once we, and part of the beg for making the decision is that we feel uncomfortable in the uncertainty when things are not decided. So we want a choice or a clear point of view. So when it comes to my kids, there's like more tension when it's not like, okay, this movie is the one we're going to pick. You just feel that anxiety of which movie. But when it comes to the workplace, you feel the anxiety and the uncertainty about what's our strategic direction. I want to know and I want it clear. Or I like to say that if we want to remind ourselves about how anxious we get in uncertainty, we can all take our brains back to March 2020 when the pandemic was just beginning. We all felt a lot of uncertainty. There were some really clear questions like to mask or not to mask, to isolate or not to isolate, to wash our fruits and vegetables 5 times or not to wash our fruits and vegetables. And we felt a lot of anxiety. We wanted clear answers for all of those things when there weren't clear answers about all of those things. So we can see how our brains go to this either or really quickly. And I want to just pause there to just notice why it is we go to the either or, because indeed, to your point, it's hard to get to the both and I'm happy to talk more about how to get there.
Yeah, and Wendy, I think the great thing I love from your book is the power of when you do get there. Like when you do get there to the both and you're able to bring forth a strategy in a direction where we're getting economic, environmental, social, or we're able to navigate that decision in life, whether we should move to a different location or stay put. Like I guess both and or either or thinking applies to everything in life. But do you mind taking us through a few key steps that organizations or individuals can use to think about how do I navigate this to head down that both and path, get the better outcomes and manage that tension?
Yeah. And when it comes to, so by way of example, and I just want to acknowledge, we can talk about examples, and I've sort of thrown out a bunch at the strategic level of organizations. We can talk about societal level challenges, and we can talk about the very personal. How do you parent your kids, or how do you partner? So we can go across all of those. By way of example, one organization that we engaged with when we wrote the book and that we interviewed was Unilever. So some of your listeners might know about Unilever. The very fundamental story is that Unilever is a packaged goods company headquartered in the Netherlands and in the UK at the time. In 2008, they were on a death spiral. Paul Pullman was brought in to be CEO. He said it was such a death spiral that Unilever, which owns brands like Lipton iced tea, and they now own Ben and Jerry's and Dove soap, that you would go into the bathrooms of their headquarters and they wouldn't have their own soap, or they'd have a competitor's soap, or you'd go into the cafeteria and they would have the competitor's iced tea. So or ice cream or whatever else they sold. And he turned it around significantly over the 10 years that he was there. And the turnaround was linked to what he called the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. And it was a commitment that he made to double the profits of this company, not alongside, not in spite of, but through a commitment to very specific environmental and social goals. Goals about how they were going to improve the lives of people around the planet, how they were going to improve the environmental footprint that they had as a packaged goods company, both in terms of the products they use, the ingredients, the packaging, the manufacturing, and what have you. And that was really powerful. And for Paul Pullman, there was a couple of really important things, and we break it down into 3 big steps, or I guess summarize it in 3 big steps. The first is noticing the tensions and changing the framing or the questions we ask about those tensions. So for Pullman, he would say to us, gosh, like it's not like if I'm going to make a commitment to these two things, the tensions are going to come up all the time. It's things like, do we sell in smaller package? Do we sell our shampoo in smaller packaging so that we make more revenue on selling more of these? Or do we sell in larger packaging? Because frankly, that's better in terms of environmental impact and the size of the packaging. That's like a real tension that comes up all the time. And those would be persistent, prevalent throughout the company. His point that he said to us is that if those tensions are not coming up, I ask for them because I surface them, and then we change the question. Then the question is not, do I improve, the impact of, or diminish the amount of pollution from my manufacturing plant, or think about my bottom line for my plant. It's how do I change the question to an and question. How do I do both?
Yeah.
How do I do both? What we find in our research is that very fundamentally, just noticing that we're asking either or questions and changing to a both and question opens up all kinds of creativity, innovation, possibility, interest along the way. So that's number one. I'm going to pause for a second, but I can tell you 2 and 3 if that is useful.
Yeah, but that's amazing, isn't it? Just a simple step in behavior in altering the questions we ask in situations, rather than which one of these should we do? How do we do both? How do we navigate both? How do we achieve both outcomes? What could be achieved to achieve both results? It's a simple situation, but it can alter everyone's thinking in that team or whoever's involved in that paradoxical situation, looking at those two.
Yeah, and Brad, it's so valuable to just pause here because if your listeners are listening, I would, and you've floated off into whatever you're doing, I would underscore, and come back to this point of the value of changing the questions because it makes a huge difference. We see this in the first point, and here's the homework, if you will, for anyone listening, which is over the next week, notice how often we frame our dilemmas as either ors because they're competing for resources, time, people, money, financial resource, whatever it might be. Notice how often we frame the either or and just invite in what it would look like to change to the both and
Yeah.
what the impact of that might be.
And it's such an easy step to do, isn't it? It's just the question we're framing in our mind or the question we're framing to another person or a team to get, more than just ourselves thinking.
When I go in and work with companies, and there's tons of research. I have an incredible community of colleagues now doing this research around the world to understand how we think about paradox, how we think about the both. And the most basic thing is this change the question. And when I go into companies and work with senior teams or do workshops for employees, the hope and the number one thing that I leave behind is an invitation for them to collectively understand the language and to notice collectively and hold each other accountable to the or, and notice the and invite in the and. And when senior leaders come back to me and say, yes, collectively on the senior team, we have changed up our language, that's when I know that there's opportunity for them to move forward.
I think, Wendy, on it, I'm even reflecting myself. I remember I was on a senior leadership team and board for about 14 years ago, and I was highly I've always been environmental, but I was really kicking into the space in organizations. I'd say that prior to that, I was more just focused on charity rather than thinking about the organization. And so I challenged the team. I said, because we were talking about strategy, and I challenged the team and I said, like, okay, team, what are we going to do about environmental? How are we going to get the outcomes environmentally? And in this team, I remember being shot down, actually. I remember being told, oh, until customers care about it, we don't care about it. We're not going to do anything, and that was very much a either or situation. Whereas I can imagine if I had the both and thinking back then and read your book, I could have gone, okay, team, now let's just talk about for a minute, how can we get both? How can we get the economic elements we're all talking about and also do some good for the planet? Like, just at least keep things the same for our kids in the future. That would have been a different moment. Now, I can say that that company has become highly environmental and does great things in circularity now. So they have transitioned, but it could have happened earlier.
Yeah, and I think, Brad, what you're noticing is that the invitation is for us to do it in our personal lives or in a corporate space, in an organizational space. The invitation there is for courageous leaders to stand up and create the conditions for a culture change, to be able to use language like that and not have it shut down or shot down. That's what Paul Pullman did at Unilever. That's what we have examples throughout the book of incredible leaders that are able to say to their teams, we've got to do both. One of the leaders is someone, I'm sitting here in Newark, Delaware, at the University of Delaware. Excuse me, and right up the street from us is W.L. Gore and Associates. Some people might know Gore-Tex and the jackets, and they make everything from the jackets to military equipment to guitar strings to medical equipment, dental floss. And their senior leader was a woman named Terry Kelly. And Terry Kelly, one of the big issues that they grappled with at their company was the tension between the small, local, autonomous decision-making, because their company was founded by Bob Gore on the commitment to pushing decision-making down into small teams, empowering small teams. They had this language of the power of small teams. And yet, by having a ton of small teams running around with a ton of autonomous decision-making, it was really hard for her to have an enterprise-wide strategy. Like, they were on all these different systems and people didn't know how to talk to each other, and there wasn't this bubbling up into a collective value. And she was pushing for this collectiveness without losing the small teams. Well, as soon as she pushed for the enterprise-wide, global set of strategic elements, everybody said, oh, because our brains go to an either or, you must be killing the mojo, the culture, the value of small teams. No, she was trying to create an enterprise-wide strategy that would empower small teams, but that was hard. And so what she used to say to her people, her team, was, hey guys, in order to live, you need to be able to both breathe in and breathe out. So we need the power of small teams alongside and being able to have this global structure. And if we do this well, and by the way, here is the bonus, the aha, the benefit of the paradoxical approach, of the both and approach. If we do this well, it's not just that they sit side by side, it's that they reinforce each other. The global is enabled by an incredible amount of small teams, and the global can enable the autonomy and structure of those power of small teams, power of autonomous teams. So that's where the magic comes in, is not just that we do both, but that they are synergistic, interdependent, holistic. They reinforce each other.
Yes, it's great. Wendy, I'm guessing they went down some sort of path of a strategic alignment and deployment system, or some way that we line up our comms and systems like that. A lot of our listeners love that space, Wendy, so that would be right on their topic. And then while still maintaining that small team high performance, autonomy and speed that comes out of that. Yeah, it's amazing. Hey, Wendy, you mentioned two other elements. So we've got the way that we frame questions, and that's a really powerful conversation. I can see how that just shifts thinking. What's the second key element of how to move to more both and thinking?
Yes. Step number 2 is how we analyze these competing demands, dilemmas, challenges. Our typical way when we have an either or when we face a dilemma in an either or approach, is we pull them apart, we separate them, and then we analyze that separation. And what I mean by that is, we have a strategic dilemma. We are trying to figure out whether to move into and engage breadth or focus on depth, or we're trying to move it. And we pull apart the alternative options in service of choosing between them, analyzing and choosing. And in our personal lives, that could look like making a pro-con list. In our strategic lives, that could look like some big data analysis of the different alternatives and options. But it's an analysis in order to pull them apart and make a decision. The alternative is, instead of separate and analyze, we call it separate and connect, pull apart and bring together, differentiate and integrate. The language we use is separate and connect. And what we mean by that is that in order to really navigate the both and, you do have to understand these alternative competing options and know what's at value for in what's valuable for each one. So for Terry Kelly, it's what do I really love about what is valuable about the small teams, the autonomy, the like what are the pieces of that? Why is that super useful? What is valuable about having something more global and enterprise wide? We have to really, what's the cultural piece to it? What's the identity piece? What's the strategic piece? What is at stake at each of these? And once we've done that, then use those data, those insights, not to say, okay, now which one do we choose? To say, now how do we bring them together in more powerful ways? Find the points of connection, find ways to integrate them with one another, find the synergies. And part of doing that is about saying, how are they connected to a bigger, broader, overarching vision? Like, what are we trying to do here in the big picture? What's the big picture 5-year longer term vision that enables us to bring these two together with one another? If any of your listeners have ever taken a negotiations class, this is the classic analysis move, analyzing move that negotiations tells you to do, which is that classic negotiations in your sort of is pull apart, each side says what it needs and then decide who gets what. A more integrative negotiating strategy is pull apart your different needs so that you really put on the table the different interests at heart so that you have more information to be able to bring them back together in a more integrative way. So that's number 2.
And Wendy, with that, I love that approach. You're unpacking both, looking for the main value elements in both, or what are the major benefits or wins, and then you're pulling it back together to really look for that connection, or that how can we get both the wins? How can we get that win-win situation out of both these elements? Which I guess for Gore organization, I couldn't really imagine, like it's like where we got this autonomy, this speed, this engagement, this innovation in the small teams. And then over here on the alignment side, well, we've got uplift on, aligned energy, shared learnings, all this type of stuff. And it's like, well, okay, right, we've unpacked it. You look at the value. How do we bring it back together? Is that correct?
Yes. And how do we find an alternative? So that brings us to number 3, the third component, if we can go there.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So if number 1 is how we frame the question, how we understand the paradoxical nature of the question and change the question. And number 2 is the analysis, how we move from pull apart, and separate to analyze to choose to separate to connect. Number 3 looks at the outcomes, what we're looking for, what we're trying to accomplish. And here's where we offer sort of 2 different outcomes. We say that we move from making a choice on a particular decision to choosing across a variety of decisions, looking at choosing as an ongoing balancing. In the paradox space, we talk about, and this is going to get a little heady, but I'll give you an example. We talk about moving from sort of deciding or resolving tensions to negotiating, navigating, or embracing them, because the argument is that the tension never goes away. What we're trying to do is figure out how do we move forward given the tension. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that typically when people think about the both and this is, I think you and I were talking about this a little bit in advance, we typically think, oh, there's going to be an ideal win-win that you can accommodate both at any moment, that I'm going to come up with this ideal solution, that there's something that works for everybody. And we call that the creative integration. And the metaphor we use for that approach is the mule, because the mule is the oldest living biological hybrid that we create, which is the better or smarter than the donkey, stronger than the horse. We get the mule, and it's this incredible pack animal that we've bred for centuries. And I might have said this, but when I started out looking at these both ands at IBM and looking at how they manage the innovation in existing space, I expected that we would find a lot of these mules. Like, how do you introduce innovation that also values all of the talent and ideas that you had already developed, and it values your supply chain and your sales channels and all of your resources that you had already built up? And I found that those happened sometimes, but not that often. That the expectation of these great win-wins, both and, creative integrations were not that often. That instead, what the great teams at IBM were doing is what we call now, or the metaphor we use is tightrope walking. And what we mean by that is that they were encapsulating each of the decisions that they had to make within a bigger, broader spectrum of decisions over time, and making these decisions in what we talk about as being consistently inconsistent. And what I mean by that is that a dilemma would come up about, well, how do I allocate my engineers? Because I have to figure out if I'm going to allocate them to developing and responding to my current customers, clients, and updating the current products that I have, or whether I'm going to use them to innovate and develop the new thing. And there was a limited number of engineers. So where am I going to put my engineers? Well, it wasn't that there was this win-win. They're going to do both at the exact same moment. They had to allocate their engineers. But that was one decision amidst all kinds of decisions that they were making. And sometimes those decisions would lean a little bit more toward their innovation, and sometimes they would lean a little bit more toward their existing product. And they would be going back and forth so that over time, the composite, the totality of their decisions allowed them to do both. And we use the metaphor of a tightrope walker because the idea is that in order to go forward on the tightrope walker is never fully balanced. They're always making these slight tweaks left and right to be balancing, but they're not overextending to one direction or overextending to the other, because then they'll fall off. They're tweaking between the two. And, that's what happens, for example, when with Terry Kelly, she had to decide which of the decisions are going to be global decisions that we make centralized, which of the decisions are decentralized. So we're not a centralized or decentralized company. We're making different decisions at different levels. That's what happens when I raise my twins. Sometimes he gets the front seat of the car and sometimes she does, or he gets the movie and sometimes she does. That's what happens with work-life balance, right? It's work-life balancing. Sometimes I'm spending an extra time at work and sometimes I'm home for dinner, but it's not. So the important thing is that we are not overextending to one of these decisions or the other, and thinking about the big picture of what we're trying to accommodate, and thinking about how these two sit, these different poles, these different opposing options sit within that accommodation of the overall big picture.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then I love the analogy of the tightrope walking there, and you can apply it directly to thinking about life in general. Wendy, what would you say an organization needs in place that leaders can then walk that tightrope, and that tightrope is heading in the right direction? What are the key elements you go, right, this is the key? Because I'm thinking of Unilever, and I work with Unilever, but I'd love to hear it from your side on what do you need to put in place to allow people to be aligned and walking that tightrope between the two or three?
Yeah. Brad, I'm going to send you to chapter 10 of the book. What we do in the book is we lay out a broad understanding of both and then we say, well, what does this look like in our individual lives? What does this look like in our interpersonal relationships, small groups, and then what does this look like in the organization? And at the organization, we use Unilever as the organizational example. And we say there's sort of two big buckets of things. What are the things that we need to put in place at the individual level? And here it's things like how we train our people to think, to adopt a mindset, a framework around these ideas. We've done research on what we call the paradox mindset with my colleagues, Ella Marone-Spector and Josh Keller, who is at UNSW in Sydney, and Amy Ingram and my co-author, Marianne Lewis. And we have something called the paradox mindset measure available for free online. But how do we get people to think that way and train them? And at the same time, and how do we get people to navigate the emotional component of this, which we haven't even touched on, but there's a whole piece about how we feel anxious, and that leads us into either or thinking, and that's huge in the workplace. And at the same time, how do we create the scaffolding, the structures, the systems that enable this kind of both and thinking? And here's where we need courageous leaders like Paul Pullman or like Terry Kelly or others that are able to create the scaffolding of things. And it's things like, do they have a overarching big picture vision? So Paul Pullman said to us that the very first thing that he did when he went into Unilever was figure out what am I trying to accomplish in the big picture? What's my mission? What's my vision? And they have a very bold vision of creating, making sustainability an everyday part of everyday lives. That requires that they're selling, that they are managing their bottom line, and that they are doing it in a way that addresses sustainability, and both are accommodated within it. It also requires, and one other piece is what we talk about as having guardrails. What are the structures, scaffolding that keep us from going too far in either direction? In the case of Unilever, what happens what keeps them? Who are the people and the rewards and the metrics that keep them from going too far financially? Because we see that it's easy to get pulled into the short-termism. What keeps them from going too far financially in terms of their stakeholders and their board and their shareholders more broadly, and what keeps them from going too far socially and environmentally? Because we've seen that too, where some companies are so committed to social and environmental, which is so incredibly important, that they forget that they actually have to make money in order to keep committing to the social and environmental.
Yeah.
So what's the overarching vision, and what are the guardrails?
That's neat. And I love that, the vision, mission, purpose, and then what are the right, like you mentioned, the right measure and the right structures that help us know where those guardrails are and navigate when something's not right. I'm envisaging, like Wendy, like driving a car, like we got a vision of where we want to get to, and it could be a tough drive. But if we didn't have a few different gauges in our cars, we could end up in a lot of trouble, but having those gauges in our car that navigates not running out of energy or fuel, and that also has the speed, and it sort of helps you make the course, doesn't it?
It does. Part of this guardrails came out of some research that I did with my colleague Marianne Lewis, who's now at Oxford. And we were studying a social enterprise that was in Southeast Asia called Digital Divide Data. They're a work integration social enterprise. They're committed to getting the most disadvantaged people back to work through IT-oriented, labor-intensive IT work. And what we found was that they were so committed to the mission, as many social enterprises are, that several years in, they built this board, and one of their board members who had run several $1 million business said to them, "Hey guys, this is great, but you're going to be bankrupt in a couple, and very soon, a couple months, if you don't really think about your bottom line." And so this company they sort of shifted to like, how do we think about profits? How do we think about, and it went so far that they were sort of losing their mission. And so what they learned over time, and actually quite quickly, because it's a pretty incredible company, their CEO, Jeremy Hockenstein's amazing. What they learned was that they have to put some guardrails in place in terms of who their leaders are, who their board members are, what their metrics are, to hold them within a commitment to make sure that they maintain and hold their mission, because a lot of social enterprises lose that mission for the financial piece, but also that they don't become so beholden to their mission that they're not making money. And they had to put these structural guardrails in place to do that.
Yeah. I can imagine, and it's such a powerful thing when you get that right, isn't it? When you get that ultimate vision, because there's so many other outcomes, isn't there? Like both and outcomes it gives you a compelling vision. It gives you a really true purpose. It fires human energy. Like you and I could probably talk all day on the different added benefits that come from this type of thinking, particularly when we start talking strategic, isn't it? It's massive. I've had a lot of.
Oh, go ahead.
I've had a lot of people on the podcast, and we've sat in just that topic. The other fallout factors, I guess, of having a both end type direction.
Yeah. I was just going to add, when I started down this road in grad school in the 90s, again, we're leaning into an idea and a topic that is 2,500 years old. There is parts of us we can go very pragmatic of what CEOs need to do. And we can go very philosophical. I mean, we're leaning into philosophical ideas from Eastern philosophy and Greek philosophy. And when we first started talking about this, people would say to us, like, don't use that language. Don't use the language of paradox, because the real people, and that's what we academics call anyone that's outside the ivory tower, the real people out there won't get it. They won't understand. And in the last 20 years or so, one of the things that we found is that this language, this idea, the importance of both and, the importance of thinking more holistically, more integrated in our companies, in our organizations, in our nations. I mean, we're seeing a massive breakdown of both and in countries now, with the amount of polarization and the inability to have conversations across different political positions. But the need for being able to bring these different perspectives together to move forward on our greatest problems in the world, we're seeing this language pop up everywhere. And so it is both inspiring to me, and one reason we ended up writing the book was because not only were we seeing this language pop up, but we were also seeing people say, okay, I get it. Now, how do I do it? And our goal was to integrate so much of the research that we've been working on ourselves and with our colleagues and with this community of colleagues to say, okay, well, we have some ideas about how to do this and how we can support this kind of thinking and approach.
You touch on an interesting point there in the world at the moment, don't Wendy, that it's like a dichotomy where we've got a lot more of this both and thinking happening and a lot of people heading there. But at the same time, we've got a massive element of polarization, either or happening, like to a level that we probably haven't seen in, I don't know, I haven't seen it in my life. So I'm heading for 46. So we could probably say 50 years. So it's funny that in one hand, we've got a lot more both and happening. And then especially in businesses, a lot of great businesses, organizations, but at the same time, there's this insane level of polarization happening.
But I think this goes back to the idea of our emotions and how they drive our thinking. In the book, we talk about sort of these 4 categories of things that have to change to address both and a big one is our emotions. Because when we feel anxious and fearful, we snap into trying to surround ourselves with people that reinforce our point of view. We want clarity. We want certainty to comfort us, as opposed to the fact that when there are big challenges out there, the important thing to do is open up to possibilities and to that uncertainty. So I think what we're seeing is really big issues out there across the board, whether it's issues of climate, whether it's issues of, that are really big and broad, inequity, and, that some people are saying, how do I open up to what the alternative way of thinking, more creative, sustainable, holistic, interdependent, emergent? How do I let go of the things that I can't control and find new ways to think about this? And a lot of times people are, and by the way, sometimes are saying, a lot of times people are saying, I'm really, really scared, and I really just need to be comforted in that fear because I feel so anxious about the future. And sometimes those are the same people.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I can share a story in Australia where I met up with one of our senior ministers at one stage. I won't name names, and I wanted to talk to him about the circular economy and how, there's a few things going on in Australia and how could we navigate this better, get better both and outcomes, And he said to me, "Oh, Brad, my electorate's 30 kilometers out of the city. I don't give a crap about the planet, because it's like if you're near the city, that's where it counts. Out here, it doesn't count, don't care." And I nearly floored me. I'm like, seriously, you're a minister in our government and you can't, you're thinking like that still. But I did say to him, I said, mate, do you just at least want your kids to have the planet looking like it does now? Do you want that? And he's like, oh, yeah, I want that. Well, let's just talk about that. But yeah, I think it's there's a few paradigms to change around the world, I think, and a credit to you for writing a book like this that hopefully some of these people read and they go, oh, there is a way that we can actually get both and you think of that path of both and versus the path of either or. The path of either or doesn't lead to a good place, particularly in politics. But the path and or leads to a wonderful place for everyone when it comes down to that space. So a lot better than the either or path, that's for sure.
Brad, I want to say, because you're sitting there in Australia, and as I said, I had just spent several months in Australia. And I want to offer up that, on one hand, myself and Marianne, feel very proud of the work that we've done, and in particular, being able to invite the community of organizational scholars into thinking paradoxically. And on the other hand, have a lot of humility for the breadth and depth of the insights that we're drawing on. And one of them, I was doing a presentation for a bunch of doctoral students in Sydney, and there was an Indigenous doctoral student, an Aboriginal doctoral student, who said to me, Wendy, it's not just that these ideas are 2,500 years old, Lao Tzu and Heraclitus, but we in the Indigenous community have been thinking in this more holistic, interdependent way for 60,000 years. So thank you very much. And, I think that, and again, with a tremendous humility, I think that the invitation is to return to some Indigenous wisdom about more, and I keep using this word, more holistic, more interdependent, more emergent wisdom that indeed we have gone away from in our, particularly westernized scientific linear thought over the last. And I am a huge fan of one of your countrymates' books. There's a book, Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaportu. He is from Melbourne. He is an academic, and he has tried to help those of us that are not Indigenous understand some of the insights about this more holistic way of thinking from Indigenous thinking that we have a lot to learn from.
Well, I think, Wendy, the thing that's always blown my mind is that the Aboriginal community in Australia lived in some of the harshest environments with the largest ups and downs, completely in harmony for 60,000 years. That is truly amazing achievement, without importing resources and shipping in and flying in stuff. Like when you think of places like Alice Springs and Cooper Pedy and these areas, they know how to live in harmony. It's a really joyful thing to read about and learn about. So I'll put a link to that book in the show notes also. Yeah. Wendy, what would be your summary on this topic? If you had an executive or a leader in an elevator, you had 2 minutes to talk to them, what would be that summary on both and thinking that you'd say to them?
We all face tensions in the world, competing demands, challenges, dilemmas. It's not if we do so, but how we do so. And the invitation here is to rethink the how, again, in our personal lives as well as in our leadership and our organizational and societal challenges.
Well, that's the key word, isn't it? How. I love that. That's awesome. So, Wendy, how can people reach out to you, get the book, learn more?
The best way is through our website. So it's boathandthinking.net, boathandthinking.net. And we have up there, for anyone who's interested, both our academic articles, a ton of podcasts like this one. We have op-eds. We also have ways to contact us. And we also have a set of tools if people want to try and implement some of this within their own lives and in their workspaces.
Well, Wendy, thank you so much for everything you have done throughout your career and everything you'll continue to do in the future to help us create a better future. Really appreciate it, Wendy.
My pleasure. Thanks for this conversation.
Cheers, Wendy. Bye for now. What a great episode. Remember, you can go to the Enterprise Excellence podcast to download resources on topics of creating a lean and green business system, and also on the topics of system boundary mapping and other techniques you can use to walk this path of tension to achieve the both and. There were 3 key takeaways for me from this episode. The first one was to change the way we frame questions. Remove the word either and look at the word both and, or how can we achieve both. These questions are slightly different, and avoiding that word either will lead to us thinking of the broader outcome, the tension between 2 factors that will actually lead to ultimately the greater good. The second key takeaway for me was to separate and connect. First of all, separate the two competing factors, analyze them separately to understand the value of them, and then connect both back together to find that both and path forward. And the third key takeaway from me was to walk the tightrope, thinking of that yin and yang symbol and walking that line of vision, purpose, measures, that balance, and allow you to track this path between the tensions in organisation, getting that environmental outcome, the social benefits, but also the economic. Thanks again for your time and knowledge, Wendy. Thanks for helping us create a better future. Bye for now.